Assalamu alaikum, مخوف حمقفيت قدام الخمزة. Against the backdrop of the ongoing war and the intensifying mobilization of state institutions, the federal center is paying increasing attention to issues of internal stability and ideological consolidation. In recent months, there have been several developments that, in my view, should be considered as part of a single set of measures, since together they point to an attempt to introduce a new stage of worldview-driven state policy in the North Caucasus. But as a respected person often says in the context of various processes in Russia, whatever we try to do, it always ends up turning into the USSR. In January, it was announced that the educational project Russian Caucasus, implemented by the Office of the Presidential Plenipotentiary Representative in the North Caucasian Federal District, had been officially launched. The project is positioned as part of a systematic effort to strengthen interethnic harmony and implement the state national policy strategy through 2036. Although certain elements of this kind of work had been seen before through cultural projects, youth forums, the activities of various public figures, representatives of show business, and all sorts of bloggers, this is the first time these goals have been stated so openly and at such an official level. According to the organizers, special emphasis will be placed on the remote areas of the North Caucasus. This shows that the Federal Center considers these areas to be zones requiring special attention. The project includes issues of state language policy, strengthening all Russian civic identity, and youth education. It is planned, as reported, to hold a series of lectures on the history of the Caucasus, historical figures, and the process of the region's integration into the Russian state. The very name of the project, Russian Caucasus, reflects its meaning. This is not just about educational activities, but about shaping a certain perspective on history, identity, and the region's place within the Russian state. If in the past, issues of historical memory and identity often remained on the periphery of state policy, today, in an era of information openness and the impossibility of endlessly ignoring topics that concern society, the state increasingly seeks not only to explain the past, but also to establish a unified interpretation of it. By summer, the topic had already received further development. On June 9th, RBC, citing sources, reported that federal authorities were discussing measures to adjust the hierarchy of values among the population of the North Caucasus. The very wording, once again, turned out to be quite telling. We're no longer talking about the economy of security or infrastructure development, but directly about the value system, which even today in many ways differs from the model that the Federal Center considers preferable. According to the publication, the main work is being carried out in three directions. The first is the popularization of the Russian flag and state symbols. As is well known, attitudes toward Russian symbols in the North Caucasus are much more complicated than they are sometimes portrayed in Moscow offices, or even in local ones. For many residents of the region, these symbols are associated not only with the state itself, but also with wars, counterterrorism operations, corruption, the impunity of officials, and numerous conflicts between society and the authorities. That's why the issue of attitudes toward these symbols runs much deeper than just questions of patriotic education or holding another event where flags are handed out. The second area is the formation of an identity, in which residents of the region see themselves primarily as citizens of Russia while maintaining their regional affiliation. In and of itself, this doesn't seem unusual. Every state seeks to strengthen a shared civic identity. However, in the case of the North Caucasus, we're talking about a region with a complex history, strong local identities, its own perspective on many historical processes, and memories of events that often don't align with the official version. This makes any adjustments extremely sensitive and risky, requiring a fundamentally different approach. The third area that was mentioned is countering various forms of radicalism. At the same time, in recent years, the concept of radicalism has become increasingly broad and vague in the public sphere. Not only real security threats now fall under this label, but also various forms of public activity, religious self-organization, historical memory, or even criticism of certain government decisions. The debate about where security ends and total control begins seems to have long been settled, and control has won. Just remember that Larissa Tupsakova, a Circassian language teacher and host on our channel, was included in the list of terrorists and extremists. This example alone shows just how broadly such categories can be interpreted today. Thus, at the official level, the task was essentially set not only to strengthen loyalty, but also to bring the value orientations of the North Caucasus closer to the all-Russian model. Although whether this all-Russian model even exists is also a big open question. If in the early 2000s, the main focus was on building a managed political vertical, today the goal is to standardize, not institutions, but people's perceptions of their own history, identity, and place in the state. In the North Caucasus, what remains is something much harder to bring under administrative control. These are local communities and borough connections. Traditional forms of mutual assistance, religious life, community initiatives, and in general, the habit of people solving many internal issues on their own. It is precisely this environment that remains a space where people preserve their own ideas about justice, morality, mutual responsibility, and the acceptable rules of social life. And the more aggressively the state tries to create a unified ideological space, the harder it becomes to control horizontal connections through administrative methods. That is why, in recent years, law enforcement agencies have been paying attention to small local communities and any forms of grassroots self-organization. This process can be seen most clearly today in the example of the religious environment in Kabardino-Balkaria. In recent years, residents of the Republic have repeatedly witnessed large-scale law enforcement operations related to religious communities and practicing Muslims. We have covered some of these stories in detail on our channel. You might recall the Imkujev case, which sparked widespread public outcry, or the mass detentions on May 25th, when dozens of people were detained in Nalchik and Nartan. At that time, the relatives of those detained in human rights organizations reported possible use of torture and pressure on the defendants. Most of those detained are still under investigation, and many of the circumstances surrounding what happened have yet to be publicly clarified. Another area has been the cases of so-called Sharia patrols. In recent years, several such criminal cases have emerged in the Republic at once. Some of these cases have already resulted in verdicts, while investigations into others are still ongoing. Just in the past month, law enforcement agencies have reported several new operations at once. It was reported that another group of 10 people was detained in connection with the so-called Sharia patrol cases. Almost simultaneously, according to several Telegram channels, new mass arrests took place in the Baksan district as part of a case involving an extremist community. Almost immediately after that, information appeared about arrests in the village of Kichmalka, where, according to the same reports, the local imam and several villagers were detained. Later, the spiritual administration of Muslims of Kabardino-Balkaria officially confirmed the imam's death and announced a fundraiser to help his family. The circumstances of what happened remain unclear. There are many theories surrounding this tragedy. However, the very fact itself has caused a serious stir within the Republic and raises major questions. It's important to understand here, we're not talking about isolated incidents. Just based on the most well-known public cases in recent years, the number of people detained in Kabardino-Balkaria already numbers in the hundreds. And these are only the cases that became known thanks to relatives, lawyers, human rights activists, or independent media outlets. How many similar stories remain outside the public eye is unknown. However, even this does not cover the full extent of the process. Notably, it's not just religious communities that are increasingly coming under pressure. Recently, high-profile criminal cases have also been initiated against representatives of, for example, the construction business in Kabardino-Balkaria, people who for many years were considered successful entrepreneurs, participated in charitable projects, and were respected by part of society. Indeed, many of them openly practiced Islam, supported community initiatives, but at the same time demonstrated public loyalty to the state and tried to build relationships with the authorities. Some supported participants of the special military operation, publicly addressed the leadership of the Republic, expressing their willingness to cooperate, and clearly did not position themselves as political opponents of the authorities. Nevertheless, even this did not guarantee their safety. At the same time as statements about the need to combat radicalism, the very meaning of this concept gradually changed. Whereas not so long ago it was primarily associated with armed underground movements and terrorist activities, today its scope of application has noticeably expanded. There are more and more signs that any social processes developing outside of direct state control are becoming targets of pressure. And that is precisely why what is happening in the religious sphere cannot be viewed separately from other processes currently taking place in the North Caucasus. Another such process, developing in parallel with ideological pressure and the strengthening of repressive policies, is the dismantling of the last remaining symbols of Republican autonomy. The amendments to the Constitution of Kabardino-Balkaria also cannot be regarded as merely a separate legal form. They represent yet another stage in a process that the federal center has been systematically implementing for a quarter of a century, and it has developed step by step. In the early 2000s, under the pretext of bringing regional legislation in line with federal law, the very concept of sovereignty disappeared from the Constitution of Kabardino-Balkaria. The powers of the Republican Parliament were significantly reduced, and a substantial number of issues that previously fell under the jurisdiction of the Republic were transferred to the federal center. Then came the abolition of direct elections for the head of the Republic, which ultimately severed the direct political connection between the executive branch and the population. In the following years, the dismantling continued, now at a symbolic level. The concept of a citizen of the Republic disappeared from the Constitution. Constitutional mechanisms that had provided additional autonomy for the regional legal system were eliminated, and the highest official of the Republic lost the status of president. Therefore, the current amendments, which provide for the removal from the Constitution of Kabardino-Balkaria of provisions on statehood, guarantees of the Republic's territorial integrity, and the status of the head as guarantor of this statehood, cannot be called a revolution. In essence, the law is simply catching up with political reality. The Republic lost a significant part of its subject status long before this, and today, the last remaining phrases that used to remind us of a different structure of the state are simply disappearing from the text of the Constitution. It is also telling that even issues related to the territory of the Republic almost never become the subject of independent political discussion within Kabardino-Balkaria itself these days. A good illustration of this was the story surrounding Lake Tambukan. Any decisions affecting such a significant natural site on the border of the Republic would inevitably have become the subject of heated political debate. But today, such processes take place almost without any public resistance from the official Republican institutions. This once again shows that real subject status was lost long before the current constitutional amendments. Nevertheless, these changes did not go completely unnoticed. The appeal by public figures of Kabardino-Balkaria, published by the KBR Human Rights Center, as well as a joint statement by 41 Circassian public organizations from Turkey, showed that even the symbolic destruction of the last signs of Republican statehood causes concern among part of society. However, at the same time, many understand that real powers were lost long before the current amendments. Largely for this reason, today's changes are seen more as the legal formalization of a political reality that has long been in place. If you look at all three of these processes at the same time, it becomes clear that they are developing in different areas but are leading toward the same goal. The constitutional changes deprive the Republic of even the symbolic signs of autonomy. Repressive practices are narrowing the space for any independent civic initiatives, while ideological projects are meant to fill the resulting vacuum with the new system of values and identity. That's why it's a mistake to see what's happening as just a set of separate news stories or random decisions. These are different elements of a unified state policy. If, during the first 20 years, the country methodically built a vertical power structure, today we are witnessing the formation of a vertical worldview based on it. It is no longer enough for the state to control only political and administrative institutions. It seeks to influence the space where people's ideas about the past, present, and future are formed. Here, a historical analogy inevitably arises. One of the key tasks of Soviet national policy, expressed in the well-known formula, national in form, socialist in content, was the formation of a common Soviet identity. In many ways, this model really did work for decades. However, when the central government began to weaken, it turned out that beneath the common ideological shell, different historical memories, national interests, and people's ideas about their own future continued to exist. This became one of the factors in the subsequent painful process of the Soviet Union's collapse. Today, the attempt to unify the meaning of the North Caucasus is taking place under very different historical circumstances. Despite all its shortcomings and the tragic chapters of its history, the Soviet Union offered society an ambitious vision for the future: industrialization, the development of science, space exploration, the construction of new cities, and opportunities for social mobility. People may judge the cost of this project differently, but its existence can't be denied. That is why today a natural question arises. What vision of the future does the state offer to the people of the North Caucasus, besides loyalty, state symbols, and participation in military actions? Each of these processes can be analyzed separately, but together they form a single picture. History has seen similar attempts. Some of them turned out to be successful for years, even decades. But history also shows that the stability of any state model is determined not only by its ability to control society, but also by its ability to offer people a convincing answer to the question, what future is all of this being built for? It is precisely the answer to this question, and not the number of new laws, repressive practices, or ideological projects that ultimately determines the longevity of any political system. And perhaps it is this very question that is becoming the main one today, not only for the North Caucasus, but for the entire country, because history cannot be rewritten by decree, and trust cannot be created by an administrative decision. It is largely on what proves stronger, control, or the ability to offer people a future, that the way any period will one day be remembered in history depends.
Assalamu alaikum.
In the end, this turns out to be a weak episode.
Why?
Because it's unfinished. I kind of wrapped it up in some sort of philosophy. Although in reality, I'm just pointing out specific questions, just making a note for myself. You know, beggars can't be choosers. If they say that the draft offices are already starting to go door to door, people will feel it right away. In short, don't take any draft notices from anyone, don't sign anything, and don't go to this war at all. This isn't our war. We talked about this at the beginning, and we're saying it now. Do everything you can to avoid it. When I said this over the phone today, I got the response, "Oh, you're so smart. What are you talking about?" As if we didn't already know that without you. The point is, I was asked to suggest some legal protection mechanisms. I don't know. I have no idea how anyone in today's Russia can legally protect themselves, like from mobilization or being sent to war. I don't know of any such mechanisms. We could try to invite some lawyer for an interview, but from what I read and see, I think there just aren't any mechanisms left. And I basically mentioned this above as well. Those of you who have watched up to this point are our loyal, regular viewers, and you should know that very soon we'll get back to broadcasting regularly, and we'll be able to cover all the topics in our episodes. But for now, this is how it has to be. If you send donations, it'll be much easier. Salam alaikum.